I'm going to begin with a slightly strange story, which I hope will frame the lecture, a lecture which is unfinished for reasons you'll find at the end. The Scythians are a tribe that met with extinction. This is how it happened. The south winds dried up their waterholes, and there was no water to be found anywhere in their territory, which all lay to the east of the Gulf of Syrtis. They deliberated and unanimously decided, I'm only repeating what the Libyans say, to march against the south wind. When they reached the sandy desert, the south wind blew and buried them. After their extinction, the Nasamones took over their land. That's Herodotus, paragraph 173, book 4, from the Histories. I've always loved this short passage, written in 425 BC by Herodotus. Its deceptive simplicity belies a set of questions that frame this lecture. The Scilii met with extinction. Brief mentions suggest that some Scilii survived as snake charmers across the Greek and Roman worlds. Cassius Dio reports that centuries later, Octavian desperately sought out a member of the Scilii to assist the dying Cleopatra because of their knowledge of snakes. The Scilii haunt this lecture, which begins with their extinction. With our potential extinction, I'll come back to who the our might be in a moment. With the many species we have already made extinct, and with the extinctions, the ecocides we are complicit in and responsible for over many centuries. I'll turn, following that, to their response to the Ghibli, the dry wind of the Libyan Sahara that causes their extinction, their deliberation and their unanimous decision to march against the wind. So let me begin with extinction in the Anthropocene. And this, I'm going to quickly go over some territory with which I think most of you are familiar. So forgive me if I tread not so lightly over a huge academic debate. Herodotus describes an extinction event. As Elizabeth Colbert has noted, our planet's already survived at least 5 great extinctions. Events that see sudden, sharp falls in both the numbers and the diversity of multicellular organisms. The Anthropocene is a shorthand term that denotes a range of global environmental changes caused by the actions of human beings, now marked by a set of anthropogenic signatures in the geological and fossil records. We experience this primarily as climate change, global warming, pollution of the oceans, extinction of species, CO2 emissions, among other things. But despite repeated warnings that go back as far as the 1970s, and indeed if you read some other histories of environmental politics, in fact go back to the 19th century at very least. It's not only recently that these warnings have been made, but at least since the 1970s, repeated warnings from scientists have told us that human activity on the planet is responsible for what will potentially be another extinction event. We have emitted, despite the warnings, more CO2 since the early 1990s than in the rest of human history. It's quite extraordinary that in the period when we claim to know most, we've actually emitted far more CO2 emissions. The global warming targets agreed in Paris in 2015 will, as we all know, not be met. Many mammals, amphibians and insects are already extinct, and the background extinction rate is estimated to be 1,000 times higher than under so-called normal conditions, and what normal is obviously in dispute. Plants too are threatened with extinction. If global warming rises above 4.5 degrees, at least 67% of plant species that populate the Amazon would die. And that doesn't take account, of course, of the continued depredation carried out against peoples of the forest by Bolsonaro, by farmers, and by others that destroy those ecosystems. Yet, most climate scientists agree that humanity does not face extinction, despite what the Hollywood film would tell you. It's unlikely that all of humanity will face extinction. Many billions do, but not everyone. Most notably, island communities, those who are on coastal plains, who live in river basins, and the indigenous and forest peoples of the world already dispossessed following centuries of propertization, capitalization, and colonization. Note only the small detail in Herodotus' text at the end. Once the Psylli are extinct, the Nasamones took their land and territory. That, of course, is the future imagined by some on the right today, who do acknowledge the basic facts of climate change, but they reject the need to alter how we live, trumpeting survival of the fittest, the extinction of some human beings as a necessary adjustment for the planet, the occupation of the land of others, Trump in Greenland, the colonization of other planets, Musk. Any extinction threatened by the Anthropocene, then, replaced centuries of enclosure, colonization, and propertization. In that light, I could have used a range of other monikers, familiar from the scholarship, to describe our present, the Capitolocene, Moor and Muln, and who knows what the pronunciation is, the Chithalocene, Haraway, the Plantationocene, in a wide-ranging debate that goes beyond the science, recognizing that the anthropos at issue is in fact a small proportion of humanity. I don't dispute that, but my use of the term frames a related issue. Paul Crutzen, who first used the term in 2000, never interrogated the notion of the anthropos, the way of being implied in a particular conception of the anthropos, which assumes an undifferentiated universal humanity as the moving force behind the crisis, and that's, of course, what that literature I've just referred to indicates. Indeed, as Elton Krennick notes, what is called humanity is a dominant, we might say authoritarian minority that has converted the species into a destructive force. How can we call ourselves humanity, Krennick asks, when over 70% of us, and arguably more, are completely alienated from even the minimal exercise of being? We are called savages. This civilizing abstraction still functions. Humanity, that term, suppresses diversity. It denies the plurality of life forms, of existence, and of other ways of being. And I'll come back to that phrase, ways of being, which I've used a few times, which I take from Morisot, among others. The abstract separation of a species called the human from other creatures and from the earth is, in their view, bound to end in disaster. Indigenous peoples knew long before Adorno that humans are themselves part of a broader ecology from which we cannot be severed. Sorry, I'm losing track of where I am. And I'm reading, I very rarely read, but I wanted not to lose track of some of the argument. And the indigenous peoples knew too that a totalitarian relationship towards the so-called natural world, rendered as a thing, would inevitably lead to the abstraction and potential liquidation of other peoples, of those humans deemed unworthy. As Krennick argues, indigenous peoples have already experienced an extinction event. We might term it ecocide as opposed to genocide. And the continued destruction is experienced today in a range of different ways. And as Kyle White contends, indigenous studies must assume that anthropogenic climate change is an intensification and a continuation of colonialism. We can debate at which point this begins, but nonetheless I think the point still holds. For both White, Krennick, and for Kimmerer, among others, the experience of ecocide and the forced adaptation to other ways of being that this has meant means that there is a reservoir of knowledge that indigenous communities, indigenous practices draw upon that allows them to consider how we collectively, as human beings, and I use that phrase advisedly for the inverted commas that I started with, cross the wasteland, in Krennick's words. For Cranach, at the centre of this dominant ontology is private property, something I've written about extensively elsewhere. Property is, I have argued, a legal operating system, adaptable and replicable, like Word for Windows, in diverse contexts, that is simultaneously world-making, cementing the distinction between person and thing, between person and animal, between person and nature. Property embodies the assumption that there are attributes proper to humanity that distinguish it from nature and from animal life. It makes that which is not human into a thing. It allows for forms of propertization that sever humanity free of relations of necessity that make life possible, or, to be more accurate, that outsource the possibility of making life possible to certain human beings, relegated to the so-called oikos. We know that longer history. With Sylvia Wynter, I accept that the coloniality of being and of knowledge is inseparable from epistemic, political, and economic structures of racial capitalism. Anthropogenic climate change, on this view, has its origin in the period that begins with the colonization of the Americas. I won't speak in detail about that. The point, though, is that I read many of the key philosophical concepts that our tradition has taken for granted, including reason, being, and knowledge, as themselves practices, as techne, implicated in how we organize our relations to the world, as ways of being, rather than as separate forms of knowledge. Elemental to these core philosophical concepts is the deployment of reason, to police what counts as an act, to police what counts as a subject, what is a mere thing, what is proper to the discrete entities we term things. Philosophy never presents, despite its best intentions, neutral or universal ideas. These abstractions are political fictions. They require our identification, our commitment, but they also limit the ways in which we consider what it is to be human. If we are to think democracy after the Anthropocene, and that's why I've kept the phrase the Anthropos, the Anthropocene, it is this dominant notion of what the Anthropos is that requires refiguring. But that refiguring cannot be a self-making, another valorization of the neoliberal subject free to deploy and remake its properties independent of its imbrication in a set of other relations. Otherwise we repeat the same logic. That version of the Anthropos is implicated in century-long histories of ecocide. And arguably, much democratic thought is complicit in those similar logics. And I know that Wendy has been working in various ways. I've looked at some of the interviews, more recent interviews. Wendy's been working in various ways, related ways, with these arguments. Central to this is a now centuries-old distinction between person and thing that I've written about elsewhere. What is at issue for me is a way of being, a configuration of relations that distributes qualities, attributes, assumptions, and that defends certain hierarchies and practices that are so baked into our everyday life that even though many philosophical arguments have moved way beyond these debates, they're still implicated in the ways we live in the world. I apologize for the more slightly abstract formulation and also for doing an injustice to a huge amount of philosophical debate. But I wanted to emphasize that what is termed the anthropos instantiates a dominant way of being. And as psychoanalysis has taught us, to know the limits of such a way of being, to know, does not necessarily transform how we are. In fact, that knowledge may well breathe new life into perverse, reactive formations. Knowledge and being don't always coincide. I want briefly then to consider two distinctions before I turn to democratic politics that support this dominant notion of the anthropos: man and animal, culture and nature. And again, please accept my apologies if I'm going over ground that I know for many people is taken for granted. In one rarely discussed note to the dialectic of enlightenment, which I have on purpose put into this lecture because Ava and I have had a conversation about this in previous occasions, man and animal, Adorno and Horkheimer write, reason mercilessly advancing belongs only to man. The animal from which he draws his bloody conclusion knows only irrational terror. Their want of reason has no words. The whole earth bears witness to the glory of man. Unreasoning creatures have encountered reasons throughout the ages, in war and peace, in arena and in slaughterhouse. The notion of the anthropos relies upon the drawing of an apparently strict border between the human, a border that's always transgressed, between the human, its animal others, and nature. And democratic participation depends on an ideal of agency attributed to the human, a supposedly universal humanism, secured by withdrawing reason and language from most creatures. Animality and nature are, in my view, political technologies that distribute participation in the polity. As Zakiya Iman Jackson argues, racialized gender and sex are also the essential horizon for the production of this figure we term the animal. The drawing of the distinction between the animal and the human and nature, secures what is proper to human beings. It is this distinction that Derrida, in his wonderful last text, The Beast and the Sovereign, teases apart. And I only want to pick out just one element of that text, which I've always loved. I mean, among other things, the critique of a certain version of Lacanianism is both brutal and fantastic. But there is a point at which Derrida draws this distinction between man and animal and says, who is it that fits into this set and who fits into this set? And I always draw the sets on the board with students. And what's interesting is that we put every other creature into the set called animal, and with that set, we can then objectify, we can thingify, we can make into industrialized food production, everything that is, and it's reduced to the same. And what Derrida suggests is what if the relations that we bear have nothing to do with two sets, but in fact have to do with a multiplication that's potentially infinite, in which the differences that we draw are themselves wholly distinct between man and egg, between man and chicken, between man and what that does is it remakes man at the same time as it remakes those other creatures. And what that then allows us to think, which is what I want to talk about when I get to the second part of the lecture, I'm now going completely off piste, what I want to talk about in the second part of the lecture, is to think about what it would mean to think those differences in relation to equality. And what does that then do to the politics of equality? Because now equality becomes a multiple, a difference, that allows us to begin to attribute different ways of working with and living with other creatures. And of course, this is a fantastical world. It's not a world that we will necessarily see in our lifetimes. But I think the task of democratic theory today is to begin to break down the distinctions that have founded what we call the demos. That distinction is supported by another abstraction, nature. An abstraction that justifies a particular relation to an external reality we deem malleable to human intervention. In The Idea of Natural History, written in 1931, Adorno insisted that nature has a history, and that history too is implicated in what we term nature, trying a long time ago to begin to break down these distinctions. But the abstraction nature withdraws history, world-making, from those who are deemed closer to nature. And we know how this is figured in the history of democratic struggles. But the point cannot simply be that humans recognize that they are subject to natural processes. Rather, what we now know as the human is made precisely in the drawing of the distinction between the human and nature, between the human and animal. The point is both sides of the equation have to be redrawn, and that requires a rethinking which is far more complex than I could possibly begin to think about today. It perhaps harks towards a writer like Deleuze, towards more indigenous forms of theory than the traditions that I am more familiar with. Reason, the realm of freedom and moral decision-making, bestrides nature as its object. If humanity is rethought within the sets of animality and nature, then those two terms explode in a multiplicity that remakes how we conceptualize ourselves. Now, I realize this is generalizing and abstract. But what is not abstract is what we have done to those things we call nature and animals. So the abstract philosophical argument in some sense already shapes the relations we bear, what I called ways of being a moment ago, to the rest of the world. We can begin, I would argue, in rejecting these, what is a mobile army of metaphors. We can begin to rethink democracy, which is what I want to do now, in a manner that Robin Wall Kimmerer calls a democracy of species. This discussion rests on the assumption that informs how I think democracy after the Anthropocene. I assume first that the dominant form of what we term the Anthropos is implicated in no longer colonial and capitalist history. What humanity has become is not what humanity is. We could be otherwise. Second, I recognize that those histories overdetermine the differential effects of climate change. The sediment of those longer histories layers the present and will remain in the future, like the chicken bones that now populate the fossil record. And third, thinking beyond the dominant version of the Anthropos must undo the simplistic distinctions, man and animal, history and nature. Such an undoing is also potentially a liberation. But, and just to be clear, I'm not suggesting that all creatures are equivalent, that we should deliberate with all animals, that we should configure, as Chaucer once proposed, a parliament of fowls. Despite this, we can begin to remake equality beyond its current confinement within the walls that we call the human. So let me turn now to the second part of the lecture. How much time do I have left, Hannah?
15.
15 minutes, okay, that should be okay. The Ciliae sit, deliberate, and decide unanimously. Consider the implications for democratic politics, noting the surprise registered in Herodotus's reporting. He says, "So the Libyans say," as if he can't quite believe that this tribe of peoples in North Africa would sit and deliberate unanimously. I can hear the question mark in his comment. But other than this, Herodotus does not qualify this claim. In the face of imminent extinction, it seems that all, without qualification, deliberate. We're not told anything about children or women or anybody else. He just said they decided unanimously to march. So what is stranger still is and I'm going to call it an anthropomorphism now, in concluding I'll challenge that, is the strange anthropomorphism. They march against the wind, as if it is an actor, as if the wind is another actant that they engage with, to use Bruno Latour's language. This is more than personification. One doesn't march against a metaphorical enemy. No, this is an enemy that we think they might want to defeat, that they hope they can defeat, or if not, that they have resigned their beings, their futures to. Today, and I'm going to use a language that I know some would object to, inanimate and animate matter resists. When the Ciliae marched against the wind, we cannot know if they imagined victory, but they did not deny its powers. We can imagine that discussion nearly 2 millennia later. Doubtless difficult, contested, but democratic, at a time when democracy was struggling to take form in Athens with the reforms of Cleisthenes. We know that what Keane terms assembly democracy was widespread across the Greek and the Persian worlds, extending south into Africa, north into parts of Europe, then considered barbaric by the Greeks, and all the way to India. As Anne Norton argues, it's time to forget the fiction that Athens was the font of all democratic politics, a 19th century myth that plays its part in securing ideas about European civility while justifying colonialism and slavery, which is not, of course, to reject our engagement with many of the debates and arguments and texts that arise from that period. Instead, a genealogy of democratic practices would include the multiple sources and histories that are irreducible to this European myth. This would include the peoples of the Libyan desert, now a speck of dust in a much longer history. But if Herodotus pokes us into reanimating this history of democracy, and I want to hold on to the word democracy. Yesterday it was suggested that the problem is democracy. I'm not sure we have anything else but what we call the democratic heritage to work with. But I want to reanimate and remake that heritage in order to avoid three possible futures. And now I'm taking more time than I want to, on people like Musk, an eco-fascism that I think is probably Musk's worldview, or an eco-authoritarianism that imposes solutions without democratic engagement, invoking the emergency as its modus operandi. But in doing so, in doing this, there are three things that I want to do to democracy, which will lead me to conclude the lecture, and which I said are unfinished, in part because in doing what I want to do to democracy now, I'm not sure I begin to address the forms of anthropocentric climate change that I've been speaking about in the first part of the lecture. And you'll see why, and hopefully we can think of a working through together that might begin to do that. First, I want to think about the time of democracy. Climate change forces us to recognize that we can no longer understand democracy as the punctual response to a current crisis. To do so is to reduce democracy to something that we who happen to live now can do with little concern for the generations to come. I argue that democratic politics takes place in that rare verbal tense, the future imperfect. And thank you to Jenny Gunnison-Payne, whom I developed this with in a conversation with Jenny some time ago. The future imperfect asserts and establishes what will always already have been the case. I use this positive formulation as opposed to Derrida's democracy a venire, which always suggests the potential for some delay. Such future anterior acts are not bound by the present tense. They disturb both the past and the future, and they extend equalities in ways that we had not anticipated. Today's emancipator, though, and this is a phrase from the text that Jenny and I wrote together, today's emancipator, though, always dances a two-step with the shadow of tomorrow's oppressor. Democratic struggles occur in contingent circumstances that lend them a temporary propriety, but they're haunted by a future anterior that they can neither anticipate nor discipline. Democratic politics then assumes that there is a future. It reckons with that future in response to what we now know is the coming storm. The unbearable responsibility implied in Derrida's account of democracy to come nonetheless demands that we act now, always with a view to this contingent future, always aware that we make errors. But such a view of democratic politics also means that we read the past differently. I've characterized democracy in previous writing as an improper practice of equality without proper temporal bounds, because it disturbs notions of linear progress. Democratic potentiality can never fully be colonized by either states or regimes. And this is something that Wendy has said in a range of different contexts in previous work, which I'll, if I have time to, I'll come back to. This account of the demos prizes it away from the sacred attachment to sovereignty. Every proprietorial order gives a shape, a tenor to equality, but it never exhausts democratic power. However, those who enact democratic equality do so in the face of the catastrophe described by Benjamin in Thesis 9 of his thesis on philosophy. Optimism in the face of horror, which is what I want to insist upon in reconstructing democratic potentiality, optimism in the face of horror is the paradoxical force of a democratic equality caught in the storm blowing from paradise. Looking back, we must see not only the debris piling high, we see too the ways in which politics was always eco-politics, as Cooper has argued. We see that repeated warnings about the climate crisis were denied. We can even from the wreckage begin to constellate the shards of other futures that have been lost in that past, exploding time, so to speak. Democratic politics debates with our ghosts, with the sediment of their remains, in order better to imagine our futures. I said ghosts, but those ghosts are, of course, material to the core. They are the sediment we inherit. So that's about the time of politics and thinking in a different set of tenses. I'll argue second that the words demos and kratos harbour more promise than is immediately apparent. Let me begin with a quote that Wendy Brown takes from Sheldon Wolin. "There is no such thing as a democratic state, since states abduct, institutionalize, and wield surplus power generated by the people. Democracy always lives elsewhere from the state, even in democracies." I think this is right, though as you will see, I want to inflect this in three ways that I hope are productive, though it does leave me with some problems when considered in light of climate change. 5 minutes. The first of those is the demos is not the people. I want to insist on a distinction between demos and people that is very rarely discussed in the secondary literature. Since the French Revolution, we've imagined the people as the sovereign agent of democratic politics. I think this is an error. The way in which Livy describes the people in Book 2 of his early history of Rome would scupper any historical claim that the demos is equivalent to the people. But leave aside the history. To put it simply, the demos acts on the assumption of an equality without prior qualification. Equality is not equivalence. Any equality worthy of the claim recognizes that differences matter, the differences that enable different but good lives. Refusing a conflation of the demos with the people allows us to take distance too from contemporary populisms of both the left and the right that in all cases presuppose a difference between those deemed proper to the people and those who are not. I think that Leclerc and Mouffe are wrong when they insist that the drawing of such bounds is constitutive of the political. This is not to deny that in specific, historically determinate circumstances, a populist articulation can, and sometimes does, extend equality. Second, I want to rethink the notion of the demos. The demos doesn't predetermine how many, or who, or how they should exercise power. Monarchy and aristocracy link political power to the one or the few, but the demos cannot be accounted for without secondary qualifications which themselves have to be justified in terms of equality. This is one reason why democratic politics is allergic to neoliberal economization and accounting. Its valency is of a different order. If exclusions are made, they are only justifiable insofar as they extend equality. For example, it would make no sense for abled people to determine how those deemed to have disabilities should access a university lecture hall. One consequence of this is the perhaps counterintuitive recognition that the demos is not equivalent to the rule of a predetermined majority. In fact, it may be that the promise of democratic equality, its enactment, is preserved, protected, sustained by an individual, by a group of individuals, by those unrecognizable within what we call a democratic order. Think only of the politics of immigration that Wendy briefly indicated at the beginning of the conference. This also allows for a pluralization of the demos. The focus on sovereign power, so central to political theory, never quite cut off the king's head, and we perhaps missed the capillary operations of power, the multiple sites where, as Gramsci might have noted, hegemony is one. From the church to the family to the school, the primary sites, of course, of right-wing authoritarian organization for decades, prior to the seizing of power in more recent times. So I think we need a richer account of the demos that severs the demos, not wholly or completely, but severs the demos from the assumption that it is captured by a sovereign people or state. Secondly, kratos or power is not the power of a regime, what we normally think of as political power. Unlike archaea, a form of power that always refers back to a regime, kratos indicates the common power to act, to make decisions about what affects and affects lives. including the multiple diverse forms taken by capillary networks of power. And I'm drawing here on the work of Josiah Ober, who rereads democracy on these terms, but then himself goes straight back to the sovereign state without thinking through the borders that he's immediately drawing and how that contradicts the rich account he's opened up for the possibility of democratic power. Taken together, and I am now drawing to an end, taken together, these qualifications give some reasons for optimism, because democracy never quite disappears. We may enact democracy despite governments. Democracy is enacted by individuals, by social movements, by global collectives. It presupposes an unqualified equality, and it is not something that we wait for, as if it is an achievement at the end of progress, as a certain version of Marxism would have suggested. Democracy has to be something we do, something we enact as we remake our ways of being. Now, you can see why that qualification might raise some problems for a politics of climate change, because the immediate response would be, surely we need sovereign power. Surely we need a global collective will that allows us to confront what is happening. One of my responses to that might be, well, perhaps that is simply to replicate the version of the anthropos that has become dominant, and that as a consequence replays those forms of power. But that's part of a longer debate. Last, a democratic politics of equality has no proper object or subject. Instead, it upsets those categories. If you can grant me the initial framing, then certain things follow, and not all of you will find these comfortable. Democratic demands and forms of enactments challenge all forms of propriety that limit in advance what counts as the demos. They put the reasons we give for drawing limits into question. Political theorists often hint at an unqualified right to be a member of the demos, but they all too quickly quash this idea as an unrealistic, too optimistic, dangerous excess. I want to play with that dangerous excess. If democratic politics has always had as its proper subject humanity or human beings, those beings capable of reason, what would it mean today if we take seriously Derrida's injunction to break down the distinction between the animal and between the human and its other? If there are no predetermined limits to what or who counts as the proper subject of humanity, then the notion of humanity or the qualities deemed proper to the human, speech, reason, laughter, tool-making, cannot justify the drawing of the limits that we've traditionally drawn. What I'm suggesting is that the notion of the demos, of the anthropos, that has anchored that demos is trembling today. Then how do we think, using Bennett's and Latour's words, the place of those other actors in maintaining eco-social orders, and by extension, their places as voices sotto voce in the extension of democratic equality? Bennett writes, theories of democracy that assume a world of active subject and passive objects begin to appear as very thin descriptions of a time when the interactions between human, viral, animal, and technological bodies are becoming more intense. For Bennett, this requires new procedures, technologies, regimes of perception that enable us to consult others more closely. A number of democratic theorists have begun to think the same. Will Kimlicka, Ava Meyer, Julie Donaldson, Siobhan O'Sullivan suggest extending democratic equality to other species. This requires a relativization of the human understanding of what counts as a practice of equality, recognizing that other ways of being, not altogether foreign to the human, open our senses to others and allow us to remake ourselves. As Brian Masumi argues, humans need to unlearn their alleged cognitive and moral superiority based on reason and language, to begin to think through a politics of mutual inclusion. I wanted to return to the Cillians, but I'm out of time. But the point about the Cillians is that sitting down and confronting the wind, but the wind is not really anthropomorphized, because the wind is part of a conception of the world in which the distinction between human and its others doesn't hold in the same ways in which the democratic tradition has assumed it to hold. And a last comment, note what I said about Derrida. The point, and this is one of the reasons I love that text by Derrida, the point about the beginning of the breaking down of these distinctions is not the reduction of all to the same. It's not equivalence. It's a multiplication and a remaking of equality that thinks about the appropriate ways in which different ways of being can be allowed to proliferate. And that requires a shift, a rethinking of what I call the way of being that dominates the ways in which we live today. I'll stop there, and apologies for, I think, being 5 minutes over.
This was gorgeous, and we're obviously thinking along many of the same lines as you all will learn. In my lecture tomorrow, you'll see both a lot of intersection and a lot of tension. So it would be fun to just have hours of the tension, but I'll just give you 2 minutes of it. Okay. So to begin with, when I first heard you use the phrase "to march against the wind," or Herodotus used the phrase, what's so gorgeous about it as a parable, of course, is that you hear it both physically and politically. That is to say, you hear it in a humanist frame and in a post-humanist frame or a non-humanist frame. And it just seems to me you opened that up gorgeously throughout the lectures. Are these cilia marching head down against the wind, or are they marching against the wind? And of course they're both. And that's the founding sadness in Western civilization, I think, is that's what we're up to, that's what we're up against, that's what we're trying to bring to a close, and that's what your post-Greek democracy rethinking is doing in such an amazing way. So the tensions, I'm just going to draw out a few things, mainly from your critique. I have grown really nervous about the indigeneity, colonial domination binary. Not because it's not there, but because it recapitulates something that we critical thinkers should be wary of, which is all the nightmare and horror on one side and all the innocence and beauty and knowledge on the other. And I heard that recapitulation a bit in your framing, that Manichaeanism, because I heard you identify colonial domination as ecocide, as displacement, as genocide, obviously, in the American case and many other cases, but also identify indigeneity, undifferentiated as one thing with better knowledge, better living, and victimization. I know you don't believe that, but it was in there. So I'm inviting you to clean it up a little and complicate it. And related, when you move to the reason being knowledge, what you called the techne, that represents ways of being, not just epistemologies. And I thought, here's Mark performing exquisitely reasoned critiques of the inheritance that he's also identifying with reason. Again, I want us to back off and think about the normativity that has saturated, especially the modernist forms of reason that you were identifying with, of course, the person-thing relation and everything else. But we're not going to dispense with reason. Certainly, we're not going to dispense with it with you two. And I think, again, more specificity. Of course, you're giving us the 35-minute version of your, hours thing, but I also want a little more care there. Okay. The person-thing distinction. I've been thinking about it a lot. I went back, as you probably have, to Locke, to Leibniz, to the rest of them. There's all that's wrong with it. How are we going to keep humans peculiarly responsible for the orders of power that have brought us to the brink of planetary destruction, while undoing or deconstructing the opposition, what some have come to call anthropectomy, the binary opposition between humans and nature, or humans and their other. We want to undo that, but we also, I think, can't altogether abandon what that Leibnizian, I'm even going to say Kantian tradition we're doing, with recognizing the peculiarity, not just of our capacity to build these inordinate systems of power that no other species builds, but also what, I think it's Leibniz, it's Locke, identify in the essay on human understanding, identifies as our capacity to be thinking things, by which he means conscious of past actions and potential to do differently in our next action. And that's peculiar to human beings, that consciousness and that capacity to build these inordinate systems of power, and what we then are going to get later from the existentialists and others, the capacity to be absolutely overwhelmed by what we've made and recede in the face of it. And what worries me here is going too far in undoing the person-thing distinction at the risk of erasing the peculiarly human capacity to build worlds of power and to become responsible for them through being thinking things. So I don't think we radically disagree. I mean, your move to Derrida suggested it's a question of multiplication rather than opposition, but I'm not sure where the humans are in that multiplication and where that question of our singular capacities as a species are, even if we've been idiots about what sustains us all. 2 more points and I'm done. Demos kratia. You want to get rid, I'm not going to say much about this because we're going to intersect so much tomorrow that we can have the longer argument. But the move to banish sovereignty, or to set sovereignty outside of the project of democracy, for me represents, I experiment with it as well. I'm trying to think through it as well. Obviously, we don't want the extant forms of sovereignty, not only nation state, but worse. But it seems to me that to have democracy be an effective form of governing those powers that human beings make, we have to know 2 things. We have to know who the we is that we are sharing power with in order to govern together as opposed to be governed by those powers. And we have to know what our power is. We have to know what we can legitimately do. And those seem to me the ingredients of some kind of sovereignty. Who are we who act together or rule together? And what is our power to act together or to rule together? Oh, it looks like one of my future interlocutors is about to have a big argument. But she doesn't get to have it for 2 more minutes.
It's really hot.
I know, she's biting her fingers. So I'm not sure of this, and I'm totally open to thinking it through together, all of us. But if you want Kratos to be our common power to act, as opposed to the more conventional translation, rule, the people rule so as not to be ruled by another. You want it to be the people act in common. Who are these people who are acting in common? Who's in and who's out? If it's not rule and not sovereignty, what is it? I want us to not be hand-waving here. I want us not to be gestural. I want us to really think, how do we fight the power that we're up against? With the power to act in our name and in the name of all the species on the planet. Last point, extending equality to other species. As you'll see, tomorrow I'll spend half an hour on the same problem coming through a different door. Your door is really interesting to me. I want to ask this one question. I absolutely agree that we must extend equality to other species in the abstract and in the sense of counting every species as sustaining every other species on Earth, so no species can be counted out. And yet, political equality, the capacity to act together, is a different thing. Our capacity to act together as a species might not exclude other species, but it is still distinctive to those human powers, those human capacities to deliberate together. Now, I am going to mess with the very argument I just made, so I'm giving it to you to work on first. I'm going to do that tomorrow. Okay, that's it.
There was a paragraph I left out, and but always. But in that paragraph, and it feels a bit like sitting on the fence, but I do think this is the case. I think we have a view of the state that has for a long time, I mean, we know it's wrong. The state is not one entity, and sovereignty is distributed across a range of different practices. And some of those practices enact and carry forward forms of equality that we would want and must hold on to. So the wholesale condemnation of states makes no sense. Instead, and this is thinking with Gramsci actually on a slightly different note, what hegemony requires is breaking down the notion that there is one singular entity, the state, and recognizing the state itself as a multiple with spaces for intervention where we remake elements of... So what we call sovereignty, if dispersed in that way, also allows for spaces for intervention, precisely because we don't view an homogeneous entity that we call the state. So that was the one qualification I wanted to make, because it too quickly looks like you just have the demos out here and the state there, but that opposition is from the beginning is false. The issue around ecocide and extinction, I think we might want a bigger debate about that, in part because I lived in South Africa, as you've lived in America, where I witnessed the logics that we call those logics of Western reason, many of which I want to hold on to, but I also witnessed their deployment in particular ways that have a much longer history and that I think still plays its way through many of the debates, for example, in the States and on the right today. So I perhaps, yeah, I don't want to draw simple distinction. It's not a matter of good and bad, but it is also a matter of recognizing what the dominant version of what we term the anthropos has to come to terms with if it's capable of taking responsibility for what it is and what we could be. I'll leave it there just as an initial response.